She said to turn that one off before I turn this one on, or there's feedback. Can you hear me? Is this on? The technology, it's going to kill us. Wait, can you hear me? You know what? I think I'll just use the hand. Good morning. Thank you, Shauna. Thanks to everybody for joining me this morning. That introduction made me sound like I knew a lot. So hopefully I share some ideas with you today. If anybody in the back wants to move up, there's open seats and beautiful sunshine. So congratulations to all of the Pinnacle Award winners last night. OSF, I think, took home the bulk of with some really cool projects. And I think it sort of is a testament to what we'll talk about today. When you think about all the categories of all the Pinnacle Awards, of all the different ways that healthcare organizations are communicating with consumers and providers. And when we at GLC are talking about communications with our healthcare clients these days, it's always about some potential solution, but it comes back to content and how you tell your story. So this is what we do. We're a marketing communications agency, as Shannon mentioned. We work with healthcare organizations all across the country in their communications with consumers, providers, donors, employees, and really helping them tell their story through print, email, social media strategy, digital strategies, podcasting strategies. We've been working in healthcare communications since the mid-'80s. I actually got started in healthcare communications in 1986, selling a syndicated women's health newsletter called Regarding Women in Healthcare. And I know if Teresa from Gift of Hope was here, she would know that product because St. Anthony Rockford was one of our very first clients. But back when targeting women as healthcare decision makers through communication was a very important thing that people were just beginning to do. What we're going to talk about today is really kind of content strategy and communication overload and getting back to the basics around content. There's been so many great presentations in the last couple of days, and so many of them, whether it's SEO, social media, even the marketing planning conversation going on downstairs is really all about content and why you potentially need a fresh strategy. I'm not suggesting you all do, but you all may have great strategies. And then thinking about developing a holistic content strategy. Again, when we are engaged in a conversation with a healthcare organization, a lot of times they'll call me up and say, we've been doing a newsletter and we'd like to consider working with you on that newsletter. And we say, great, we'd love to do that. How does that fit into the rest of what you're doing by way of content? And it becomes a broader conversation. And then putting that strategy into action. And I just want to say, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to stop me at any time because I'll get on a roll. And so often, again, in talking with organizations and even thinking about the various presentations today, most healthcare organizations have a strategy for these very important communication channels. And even when you look at like the SHISHMED career link email that comes across, and I watch it and it comes across and somebody's hiring for social media, somebody's hiring for digital strategy. And I'm not suggesting they don't need separate strategies, but at the heart of all of these various communications is the content. And so this is content, all of these various ways, right? Print, podcasts, advertising, social media, email, and this is content. All these various ways that most healthcare organizations are communicating with consumers through blogs and social media, direct mail, email newsletters. And consumers, and we've seen this type of illustration in a million different presentations, that consumers are, and it's not surprising, we're all consumers of content, right? And we're being bombarded by content in various ways, through our phone, through our computer, every minute of the day in some form or fashion. And so how do we sort of break down those separate strategies and build what we'll talk about as a broader, more holistic content strategy. So there's a smarter way to work. Hopefully you leave here smarter, just not necessarily because of my presentation. So when we think about a holistic content strategy at GLC, when we refer to a holistic content strategy, it's a goal-oriented process that focuses on the planning, creation, governance, distribution, and measurement of your content across all channels. And so it's really thinking more broadly about content, how it will be developed and distributed. And I think sometimes when we go into these conversations, it feels like overwhelming. Most of the time when we start our conversation, we'll either find one of two things. People have a whole bunch of content, like a lot. They're developing a lot of content, but there just isn't a lot of coordination that's going on between the development of that content. Content's being developed here, it's being developed here, it's not being repurposed, there's not a lot of coordination of effort, or the opposite of organizations that just aren't able to generate enough content. And so this is really getting back to the roots in how you're thinking about content and planning for content within the organization. This article actually just came out in September. It was a great article on why content strategy is at the heart of digital transformation. And it just was amazing that it aligned with this presentation, that we talk about your content strategy as your digital strategy. We've done this presentation before. And I thought this quote was awesome, which is, content is the engine that drives not only modern marketing and sales, but also customer delight. It ends up at the heart of the user experience sooner or later, so make content an important part of your transformation journey. And this article, by the way, was not specific to healthcare, right? This was a broader article. A part of that article also talked about, which I thought was really interesting, what typically hampers a content strategy for most organizations. Marketers think of content, and these aren't in my words, these are in Claire Forster's words. Marketers think of content as an expense rather than a business asset. Content creation is happening in a vacuum, and departments have conflicting goals. And marketers are too focused on short-term goals and fail to see the long-term gain from a user-centered content approach. And I apologize for looking back because my slides are not here up on my screen. So, and when in this article they talk about content transformation imperatives, sort of 5 key things. Focus on getting your customers' needs before your own. And I think for all of us, as we've seen the way that content has evolved over the many years, it used to be about us. We're going to tell you about our services. We're going to tell you about all this great stuff we have, how easy it is to use our services, how great our doctors are. And I know now the content that we're developing for our clients is all about their patients, the great stories, how it's about you, how we helped you, the results, really thinking about them before us, get the right content to the right audience in the right format. And I feel like I've been talking about that for 25 years. I mean, that's not earth-shattering, but you do have to think about, the difference between being very targeted in your communication, what goes out more broadly, and again, I think it all serves as a reason why having that underlying strategy is really important. Becoming an authority in your space, sort of figuring out what is it you want to own by way of communication with what is your message. Shift from short-term thinking to allow time and space for strategy. And I know as, healthcare marketers, most of you are tackling many, many things besides just what content is being communicated to consumers. And so it's really stepping back and taking that time to create that space. And then breaking down silos, which we were talking about a little bit, or I was earlier, relative to the various channels and strategies for all the various communications. So when we talk about developing a holistic content strategy, we've broken it down into these 5 steps. And we know that this is a lot of work, not assuming that this is, quick, easy, go through these 5 steps and you'll have yourself a holistic content strategy. But we've gone through this process with clients and it does work. And the thing that I'll say about this process is that we've done this with organizations like department-wide, and then we've done it on a smaller scale. For example, if we come into an organization who's interested in evaluating their website content, you can do a holistic content strategy evaluation for the website. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be across the entire department, although that's the approach that we're talking about here. So when we think about the discovery phase, which we consider to be really, in my opinion, the most important part, which is taking the time to kind of assess your current content environment and what's really working well, where are there challenges and gaps, what are your goals in terms of your communication with consumers or providers, what is your how is the content currently supporting your brand strategy? Who are the stakeholders? It's really learning, what are the challenges? What are the personas of the people that are, represent your target audience? And really, so oftentimes we'll come into an organization and we'll bring the key stakeholders together that are responsible for content and communication, and we'll go through this discussion, gathering that information in order to be able to, make some determinations about the right way to move forward. And then the second part, and this is a really important part, is auditing the content that currently exists within the organization. And going through, and gathering, we're working right now with Children's Hospital of Wisconsin on this exact kind of content strategy and their provider-facing communications. And as a specialty children's hospital, you can imagine that referring providers is the most important audience for them. And they have all these various service line marketers who are communicating constantly with providers and consumers. And so we've gone through an audit of all of their content and the ways that they're communicating with their doctors, through their presentations, through their email communications, through what they're doing by way of direct mail and print, through their their brochures, and really auditing all of that content and putting together a huge spreadsheet, really, that audits what kind of content is going out, how often is it going out, what's the purpose of that content, who's the target audience, what are the calls to action, what channels are, is that content being communicated through. And then the other important part of the audit of content is what are your competitors doing in similar ways, in order to be able to know, as part of that discovery, how do we want to differentiate. And I'll share a specific example about this when I talk about Hackensack, one of our clients, in just a minute. And then putting together the content plan. So following that discovery in the audit, identifying, what are the channel guidelines, okay? What channels are we going to use, and how are we going to manage the content that's communicated through those various channels? What format? Who's going to write the content? And how are we going to, what's our plan for putting together a content calendar? Kind of back to that idea of that longer term plan versus a short term plan. Our goal will be to put together a 3 to 6 month content plan that identifies by channel, by service line, what kind of content we're going to be developing and how often, and how is that content going to be developed. And then what are the performance measures? And this is really important. Even before we start developing content, how are we going to know if it's effective? And so what are we going to use to measure the effectiveness of the content? Calls to action, comments and shares, and it all obviously depends, and you know this in your work every day, it all depends on the type of communication you're sending out. Is it getting picked up by the press, online surveys, readership surveys in print, tracking that, the kinds of things that you can track depending on the channel. And then last but not least, really putting together that specific distribution plan. And so what you're going to be communicating through the website, through email, through social media, how you're going to incorporate videos and podcasts, mobile to the extent that that's part of the strategy. And so building, again, back from the discovery and audit, identifying what your goals are in terms of effectiveness, and then ultimately putting together that specific distribution plan by channel. And I'll show an example of what this sort of looks like on a smaller scale in just a minute. So a few tips to creating an effective content strategy. And this was a tip that we had, and it was also in that article, which is to stop working in silos and figuring out ways to bring the people together on your team, because we know you're still going to need multiple people, obviously managing all those various aspects, the various channels of communication. And I'm curious, and maybe I pick on OSF for a minute, but I'm curious in who here feels like they have a good process by which, I know that we have some clients who will huddle once a week and talk about the content development, but I'm curious if anybody here feels like they have a really good way of, or maybe CGH, of breaking down the silos where they feel like they're talking to each other even though people have different responsibilities. Anybody? Or do people feel like they're working in silos within their organization? Anybody know? I know that we have some clients that will meet on a weekly basis and do a huddle on what content is being developed that week, or what's happening that week, or on a monthly basis. Yesterday I heard in a presentation the reference to use of a platform, Trello, and we have Children's Hospital of Wisconsin actually uses that platform in the way that they're tracking their content so people know what's happening. Understanding your audience. We talked about this as sort of a part of the discovery, is understanding the personas, who your target audience is. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I find in talking with our clients is there is a broader message that you have for your community and your target audience as a whole. And then you also have more specific types of consumers that you're looking to reach in your communications, very specific personas. So for example, here's an example of Martina. She's a healthcare consumer in the Chicago area. Her dad is struggling with Parkinson's. It's in the early stages. He's been diagnosed. She's looking for ways to collect more information around how she might help and support her father, and looking to the broader web resources, but also what might be available to her within her local community, her community hospital. And so thinking about, from the hospital perspective, what are your messages for folks who are dealing with this type of topic or this type of issue? How do you reach out to them in terms of communication? What resources, and ultimately, what content is available that you can make to share with her that via email communication, offering it through the website, informational videos, overview brochure, podcast information, thinking about by service line, obviously very specific information, but again, thinking about how those folks who are dealing with that issue are going to access the information that you make available to them. One of the things that we have been talking about with clients more specifically, I would say over the last 2 years or so is the development of a consumer-facing communication brand. So when you think about, and I have found that thinking about the content strategy from this perspective kind of helps frame the idea of a holistic content strategy. And so the idea of creating, not you have your brands of your organization, it's the idea of creating a consumer-facing brand that supports all that communication. And folks like the Cleveland Clinic with Health Essentials, which is a brand probably most people in this room know, is, I would say, one of the best examples. Mayo Clinic has an amazing brand where they're creating a brand that they're using to support their communications. And this is an example of a consumer-facing brand that we worked with Hackensack Meridian Health to develop. They are a 17, actually I think as of this week, maybe an 18 hospital system in New Jersey that was mailing a publication, a magazine called Health Views, out to over 1 million households and had been doing so for about 10 years. They were about to launch a content hub for their website. They were, and stepping back for a minute, Hackensack Meridian Health is a merger of two systems, Hackensack and Meridian, and they came together now 3 years ago, and they worked for a long time building the brand of the system, Hackensack Meridian Health. Well orchestrated is their brand messaging, and then they identified it was time to sort of get their communication, because they were doing a lot of different things, really streamlined to support the brand of the system. And at that time, as I mentioned, they had a magazine that they were sending out, and it was called Health Views, and it was actually a holdover magazine that had been produced on the Meridian side of the system for about 10 years. They were about to go live with a content hub that they were going to call Health Hub. And they had an email newsletter, which is actually a syndicated email newsletter that was Health e-newsletter. And so when they went through an RFP process for a new magazine partner, and we were lucky enough to be selected, but we said, let's take a step back, because you all have so much information that you're communicating. Let's think about how you want to brand that communication. And so through the work that we did with them, we ended up coming up with Health You. It's all about the power of you. And it has the opportunity to support their dedication to the community, their commitment to education. They have 3 academic medical centers within their system, so the idea of you or university is also supported through this brand. And we went through a lot of work to create this brand, a lot of different ideas of what the right language was, what the right visual look was. And now you can see their magazine, which is Health You, their content hub in the bottom is Health You, and their email newsletter is called Health You. They also have a podcast series that they recently started called Health You. And so when we do content planning with Hackensack on a quarterly basis for the magazine, we don't do magazine planning, we do content planning, and we plan content for all the various channels. And part of what else, and so when you think about the consumer-facing brand as the communication, that most communication that's going to come out of Hackensack is going to come out under this brand, it makes it easier to think about having a content strategy to support the brand, because these are the branded elements. And the other thing that I think is really cool, because we do part of this, but we don't do all of this. They have a team that does the email newsletter. We develop almost all of the content for them, and we post content from the magazine to the website, but we also post additional content. And the email newsletter that they push out on a monthly basis pushes out the top 5 topics, top visited topics on the Content Hub from the month before, which is really smart, because those are the topics. They're using that data. And they have some pretty amazing metrics in terms of the amount of views that they have received in the Content Hub from the time they've gone live with it, the new Content Hub from January till August. We presented at Shishmet, and I should have those numbers, but in the millions in terms of their visits to the Content Hub since they went live. And they're able to track all of that activity, because when we plan content with them and we say, okay, here's the story, there's going to be a video element to it, we're going to post it on the web, we're going to push it out via email, and this is the call to action that we have. Every article has, what is the story, who's the patient, who's the doctor, where is it going to be distributed, how is it going to be evaluated. And they have marketing managers at all 17 hospitals, and they all weigh in on issue planning, and they all pitch stories, because they do 3 versions across the whole state. Across the 17 hospitals, they do 3 regional versions. So there's 5 to 6 hospitals represented in every version. And so in order to your story to be included, you have to pitch that story, and it has to meet certain criteria. And so the level of the quality of the content that they are now distributing through the system is really elevated. And if a story doesn't make the print magazine, then it has the opportunity to get slated for online. So it's a great process, and hopefully this brings that idea of the holistic content strategy and how you can represent that with a brand to life. And then creating high-quality, engaging content that can be utilized across all channels. And I think the Hackensack example is a good example of how you can do that. This is very sort of watered-down example of what a content strategy might look like when we look at developing that spreadsheet with a client. So looking, for example, at what are the key service lines that we're going to be focusing on, and that's the approach that we take with Hackensack, is starting with we plan a year in advance, and we know each issue what the main theme or what the main service lines are going to be that are going to be represented. And then identifying, within the print publication, which of these service lines are we going to represent in a given issue. And then is it going to be reproduced for the Content Hub? And then the idea of these red dots is web exclusive content. What content are we going to develop that's not going to be in print, that's going to go onto the web? And then what are we going to push out via email? And the opportunity, to be versioning. In this case, this was an example where Hackensack, as you can imagine, with 17 or 18 hospitals, the number of employees, we have a consumer email version and an employee email version. And so identifying what content is going to be distributed to which audience. And then what are we going to push out on social media? So we're posting on social media every week in all channels a teaser to content on the Content Hub. And that's part of that strategy, and part of that calendar is not only what are we going to push to the Hub, what are we going to push out on email, but what are we also going to tease on social media to bring people back to that Content Hub. And then where is there an opportunity? And I think because we're so thoughtful, typically, if we can be, and not just with Hackensack, but with many of our clients who have a digital component to their content and their communication with consumers, whether it's a blog, whether it's a Content Hub. We have some clients who take the magazine brand or the consumer brand, and they create that Content Hub. And so when we go to interview, a writer goes to interview a patient for a story or a physician for a story, we make sure we take the opportunity to get some video or to get some audio at that time. So thinking, instead of just, we're going to interview this patient for a story that's going to go in our print magazine, let's think about, we're going to interview this patient for a story that we're going to use across all of these channels. And so thinking about that before the interview takes place, so that you send a photographer who can not only take still shots, but also a little bit of video. Draft the 5 questions that you want the photographer or the writer to ask when they're interviewing that person, so you capture that all at once. And then you take that story, and we have the pleasure of working with Shriners Hospitals for Children, and they it's a newer partnership for us, and we're working on our second issue. And the cover story is about this beautiful little girl, and the photography is amazing, but we've captured video through the telling of her story, that the call to action from this, if you are not gripped by the story and the photos, to go and see her video, which is such a compelling story. So thinking about all of that, right, at the same time. And the other thing I want to say too is, I don't want to make it sound like it's magazine planning, and then you think about how else can it be used. It really is more holistic content planning, and then what goes into the magazine, for example, or what goes onto the website. And the other example for Shriners that many of you may be aware of, because it went viral as a video, was the boy who did the box jump with no arms. Did you see it, anybody? With his coach, and he tried so many times. And I did CrossFit for a very short period of time, a long time ago, and I'll tell you, doing a box jump is very hard, and if you don't have arms, and his joy. And so the digital guy at Shriners is like, okay, well, this isn't a magazine story. It's a video piece. And so how do we make sure we tie that in and promote that in, and be able to get that promoted? So thinking, again, it doesn't mean it's a print piece first that then has video added to it. It's like, we have this amazing video, how do we take advantage of it? And so when you come together and you think about all the stories that you have and all the content that you need to cover, it allows you to make sure you're taking advantage of all those great nuggets of information. And then measure everything. Yes?
Just real quick on that slide where you talk about Facebook posts. How important do you think it is to keep your look involved with Facebook?
In terms of the...
so like your post, I mean, is it going to be so redundant that you just keep seeing the same look? Or how do you use that? How do you implement your look without being redundant?
In terms of the, like the Health U, for example? Yeah. I think that there's a combination of, there's certain content that's being posted on Facebook, for example, by Hackensack, that is not necessarily related to so everything that is posted on Facebook by Hackensack isn't branded to Health U, right? So there are stories that are happening in the hospital every day, and so we're not rebranding Facebook to look like Health U. We're just identifying when there is a Health U podcast that's posted and available, that is branded, and that post is created that way, so you know that it ties back to Health U. So if it's a Health U content asset, then it's branded that way on Facebook, but not everything on Facebook is branded to Health U. Does that make sense? And then, the idea of measuring and, through the various ways that all of you I know are challenged and struggle to measure the effectiveness through web metrics, comments and shares, increased volume. We're working right now with Hackensack. We're on the 4th issue of the magazine that we're producing, and so we're doing a reader survey where we're asking more involved questions around the impact of the magazine on their utilization of services or awareness of services, which is always harder to track. All of the work that we're doing with Hackensack is integrated within their CRM tool as well, and so we're coordinating those efforts with their CRM partner. And I think, again, what makes the tracking a little bit easier is that we're thinking about it in the beginning and not at the end, so that every article that we're thinking about, how will we know if this piece of content was effective? And not every piece of content needs to necessarily be measured, but making sure we're thinking about it at the time we're developing it in order to see what's working, see what's driving utilization of services and physicians within our client organizations. So in terms of key takeaways, the idea of creating a holistic content strategy, and I know it seems like a big undertaking, but for the clients that we've worked with who have taken the step back and thought about it, taken the time to sort of dedicate resources, bringing people together, having that conversation, and being able to put down on paper, you know, a plan for how they're going to implement on that strategy, really have seen great results in that work. And I think the idea of content first and distribution second, again, I've been in the space for a long time, and people still will come up and say, we need help with our social media strategy, or we need help with, and we do that. We do those solutions, but we always try to ask about how it fits within the broader, you know, the broader group of what else is being used by way of communication. So stop working in silos, focus on your audience needs before your own, consider creating a consumer-facing content brand. And anyway, I think that the examples, and we have a number of examples, I think it is the way to kind of help pull all of these various components together. And so if you go back and you look at, you know, what are your major consumer-facing communications, if you have an email, if you have a blog, and if you have a print magazine, and they're all called three different things, you're missing an opportunity to be able to build, you know, consumer awareness, and again, a consumer-facing brand that supports the organizational brand. And then the steps to creating the strategy, which is discovery, audit, plan, distribution, and measurement. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you all very much.
As to whether it's